When Westerners first traveled to the roof of the world of Tibet, they came upon a society completely foreign to them. It wasn't that the people were so unusual, but rather that the beliefs they held were so utterly different as to be nearly incomprehensible to visitors from outside the mountain kingdom. The Tibetans seemed to have discovered the path to inner peace. Here were a people living a hard-scrabble life, yet so at peace with themselves that the Western adventurers elevated the indigenous population to a status never before bestowed upon a newly encountered society. Shangri-La, as James Hilton wrote in his novel, Lost Horizon. The English journalist wrote a fantasy about Westerners whose plane crashed in the Tibetan Himalayas, stranding them in an idyllic kingdom of peace and harmony. He wrote this in 1933, a tumultuous time in Western history, as the ravages of a world war, recession, and the rise of dictatorships were seizing the world's imagination. Hilton's novel and the movie of the same name provided a literary and imaginary respite to rampant hatred and warmongering. The imaginary Shangri-La grew in reputation as a remote, romantic, and mysterious land. For many reasons, Tibet earned this status. To the Western eye, it truly was then, and remains today, mysterious.
There's a great deal of romanticism that the West has for Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. It almost seems to be a kind of idyllic society on the roof of the world in this land of snows, surrounded by an aura and a mystique, and separated from the trials and tribulations of the modern Western world. And we kind of hold that romantic ideal up somewhat, and their mystical practices with the great deal of mysterious aura, with all of their rituals and chanting and bells and horns. As historians, one can actually kind of break through some of that veil of mystery and romanticism.
The first step to breaking through the veil of romanticism may be that of understanding. Understanding Tibetan Buddhism, seeing its palaces, its temples, where people practice Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, and discovering the Tibetan culture, embodied in many ways at the Potala Palace, where the Dalai Lamas held civil and administrative court. The center of Tibetan Buddhism is the Jokhang Temple in Lhasa, Tibet. Jokhang translates as House of the Lord, and of all the temples in Tibet, the Jokhang is revered as the holiest of all. Now, Jokhang draws people from all over Tibet and all around the world. The Jokhang lies at the center of Lhasa. Construction there began in the year 647, when Sonsten Gampo, the first ruler who unified and ruled Tibet, acquiesced to the desires of his wife to build a temple to house the image of Jowo Sakyamuni, the young prince who became the Buddha.
To help other sentient beings to make free from the sufferings and the cause of sufferings, then he see that only way by wisdom.
Pilgrims come on a once-in-a-lifetime journey to visit the holy temple and to pray here. They arrive at the door of the Jokhang to prostrate themselves before its walls, within which lies the holiest of all Tibetan effigies of Buddha.
Because the purify negativities, whatever they made it purify negativities, and to make collection positive action, collection. Because of the way we make it this ways, I think, they do make prostration by body. They say chanting or mantras says from the mouth, use it. No, like this, no doing. Says praise by mouth. From the inside, through the mind, with the mind, faith, devotion to the object. So three actions are actually same time. By bodies make respect, by bodies respect, make prostration. By speeches make positive action, by praise. By mental make positive action, by devotion and faith or trust.
This kind of prostration is a very common practice among Tibetan Buddhists in order to eradicate pride. It's a practice of humility, of humbling oneself before a being who is greater than you are. And this is a good way of trying to work on eradicating the false sense of pride that is an important and strong impediment to enlightenment.
There's a whole practice of prostrations, a formal practice, where you do certain things and you go down on the ground, then you come back up, and you're offering body, speech, and mind, so that you are surrendering your version of reality to an awake mind.
Here too come supplicants with their prayer wheels, spinning them in a clockwise motion, saying the prayers within, and aspiring to become more pure as they circumnavigate the Jokhang along what they call the Nangkor, walking the sacred path of worship within the temple in a devotion that's been taking place here for generations. It's here that the faithful who have exhausted themselves in prayer take time out from their physical exertions, but keep their rhythmic prayer and their prayer wheels in motion.
The prayer wheel is very popular in Tibet today, and its origins are probably about 300 years ago. Anyone can use a prayer wheel, from the Dalai Lama down to the most modest Buddhist person or nomad anywhere. And the prayer wheel is a cylinder that's mounted on a handle, or if it's a big one, it can be mounted on a stand, on which prayers are stamped. And every time the prayer wheel is spun, that prayer, it's the same as that prayer having been said. And so when the prayer, sometimes hundreds of prayers can be stamped onto a prayer wheel, or sometimes just one or two. But every revolution that the prayer wheel makes, that prayer has been said. And so a person who is, as part of Buddhist practice, and constantly trying to keep in mind a prayer and also trying to accrue better karmic merit so they can get a better rebirth, will spin the prayer wheel. And then this multiplies the number of times that the person could actually physically speak the prayer. And so this multiplies the efficacy of the prayers.
Tibetan Buddhists believe that this circumnavigation of the Jokhang and the praying that's at its core earns them merit, moving them forward on their path to enlightenment. Their pilgrimage is less to reach a destination than it is to transcend the details of life that inhibit awareness of a greater reality. To the door of the Jokhang they come, prostrating themselves in front of the temple that holds the sacred image of Buddha, Jowo Sakyamuni, housed inside and tended by monks. At the center of the Jokhang is the image that people come to see, Jowo Sakyamuni, believed to be the image of the prince who later became the Buddha.
It's the original historical Buddha.
Right.
And in terms of Buddhism, almost all the lineage of Buddhism go back, in some form or another to Sakyamuni Buddha as the first historical Buddha.
This is really one of the first two images that introduced Buddhism to Tibet completely. The whole array of Tibetan art and Tibetan Buddhism that followed after the introduction of Buddhism by Songtsen Gampo and his queens began with these two images, and the Jowo Sakyamuni being one of those original two. There are very few times in the history of art or the history of religion when we can really identify a beginning of a tradition or a beginning of a lineage. And the Jowo image itself, can be identified as being one of the sources of Tibetan Buddhism and this religion that completely swept the nation.
And according to the beliefs held firmly by many Tibetan Buddhists, this image was blessed by the Buddha himself 2,500 years ago.
We think during the Buddha's lifetime, there is a king of the image maker, Ashobhya, so his names. So he made, I think 12 or 8, I'm not sure, the image he made. So during Buddha's lifetime. So one of that Chinese, they got from India to China, then we got from China when Chinese princess came, queen for King Songtsen Gampo, she bought it. So very blessed, yes. Blessed by Buddha himself.
Looking down at this image are those of the people who brought the Jowo to Tibet, Songtsen Gampo and his wives.
We get Buddha Dharma in the 7th century. Tibetan king was Songtsen Gampo. And during his time, then we got the Buddha's teaching from India into the Tibet.
Above the main entrance to the Jokhang is a golden 8-spoked Dharma wheel. Its spokes represent the 8-fold path to enlightenment, and the deer serve as reminders that the Buddha gave his first sermon in a deer park.
Turning the wheel of the Dharma it's an ancient way of an ancient image or metaphor in terms of giving the teachings, giving Buddha's teachings.
The wheel of the law refers to the teaching of the Buddha, the Dharma. And this is an old metaphor from ancient India that was current during the time that Shakyamuni Buddha lived in the 6th century BC. And the wheel of the law was first set into motion when Shakyamuni achieved enlightenment and then went off to give his first teaching at Sarnath. And then he set the motion of the wheel into he set the wheel of law into motion.
Main idea is really always His Holiness Dalai Lama mentioned. His Holiness mentioned no harm, no damage for the others. If you can help to the others, must do help. No material ways. So mostly the important to help by spiritual ways.
Despite its status today as the holiest of all Buddhist temples in Tibet, Jokhang was not the first to house the statue of Jowo. That honor fell to Rinpoche Temple, built to house the image when it first arrived in Lhasa. When Lhasa was threatened by Chinese invaders, the Jowo was hidden at Jokhang, and there it was unveiled in 721. Loftier than all the other buildings in Lhasa is the palace that dominates the skyline. For a time, it was the tallest building on the planet until the era of skyscrapers. The Potala Palace, 117 meters tall, atop the red hill of Lhasa, 12,000 feet above sea level. First seen by Western eyes long after it came to dominate the Lhasa skyline, the Potala Palace came to represent the power that Buddhism held over Tibet and much of the world. Built of stone and wood, King Songtsen Gampo began building the original palace on this site in the 7th century.
Red one originally, when during the 7th century, King Songtsen Gampo made it. Then those white one, then another extension, like during the 5th Dalai Lama, and also there's extension to made. So that's so Tibetan King Songtsen Gampo, he made Potala.
8 kings followed Songtsen Gampo at Potala, and then some 300 years passed as pretenders laid claim to the throne. It fell to the 5th Dalai Lama to once again unify Tibet with the help of the Mongols and restore rule over the country and the religion from Potala Palace.
The Potala Palace then really became a symbol of Tibet as a Buddhist nation that was unified, strong, peaceful under the dynamic and strong leadership